So I call this the Great Transition. The transition from hunter-gatherer, living in symbiosis with nature, to that of agriculturalist, controlling and adapting his environment, is the seminal transition in the evolution of mankind, and for that matter the planet, since it fosters the exponential population and technological growth, the consequences of which are everywhere around us to be seen and felt. To better understand the whys and wherefores of this transition in Europe, I have studied this transition in the southwestern Mediterranean basin, which I've divided into 24 regions, which I've grouped into 6 macro regions. In the study area, I've tried to follow the progress of the Neolithization process, and in particular how the local populations responded to the appearance of this new mode of existence in their vicinity. It is beyond doubt that the Neolithic, so far as Europe is concerned, evolved in the Near East. There is no instance of independent European Neolithization processes, notwithstanding the discredited wishes of on occasion the falsification of evidence by indigenists. Subsequent to the democratic growth engendered by the Neolithization process brought about by factors such as sedentism, resulting in increased fertility and birth rates, and I'm talking about the Near East, and an assured supply of food, a series of stresses and crises occurred during the 7th millennium BC. The causes of these crises are not singular, but include inter alia elements such as the consequences of the democratic growth, unfavorable climatic events, and the breakdown of hierarchical and structured societies. In this short presentation, I will focus primarily on 4 sites and 3 regions, which each teach us something regarding the transition. The Aegean was not unknown to the navigators of the Levant, who had already visited Cyprus about 10,000 BC and colonized it a millennium or 2 later, transporting animals in the process of domestication as well as wild species they let loose on the island. Similar navigators settled on Kythnos, which is with the green arrow, in the northern Cyclades around 9000 BC, bringing Suids in the process of domestication, which they let loose to be hunted, building circular sunken huts and burying their dead according to Near Eastern traditions. About a millennium later, the island of Ura in the northern Sporats was also colonized by navigators who brought Suids with them, which they also let loose. These did not prosper, and they replaced them by Near Eastern goats, which are still there. The first evidence we have of fully Neolithic migrants in Europe with agriculture as well as domesticated animals, although initially without pottery, is on the island of Crete, about 7000 BC. Given the location of this discovery on bedrock 8.5 meters under the central court of the Palace of Knossos, about 7 kilometers inland from the then coastline, it is unlikely to have been the earliest Neolithic settlement on the island. A couple of centuries later, the same cultural group, and they had to be navigators, brought desirable objects in the form of pottery to Franchi Cave in the Argolid, and after several centuries of transition, this site became fully Neolithic. It's not clear, due to lack of skeletal and other evidence, whether an early Neolithic settlement, now underwater in the bay, which was then a plain, was established by migrants, the autochthonous population, or a combination of the two. The Iron Gates was the home of the mythical Lepenskivir culture, over which much ink has been and continues to be richly spilt, much of it correcting the conclusions of the principal indigenous Yugoslav archaeologists, correcting the carbon-14 dates distorted by the water reservoir effect, and reinterpreting the numerous sites. These sites are now mostly under the waters of the reservoirs of the Iron Gates 1 and 2 dams. The Neolithic migrants bypassed the Iron Gates, which were not propitious for agriculture, and already densely populated with hunter-fisher-gatherers. These sedentary Mesolithic communities acquired desirable Neolithic objects from about 6000 BC, presumably by exchange, with Ovicaprines after 6000 BC. Of great interest, since the region is rich in inhumations, strontium and nitrogen isotope analyses, as well as burial customs, have proved that some 9 females and 1 male buried between 6200 and 5500 BC were brought up outside the gorges, with the 7 dated from after 6000 BC coming from First Temporal Neolithic sites, so that we can fairly conclude that we are in the presence of partner exchanges. The Lipenskivia culture, or the Lipenskivia sites in the upper gorges, were abandoned about 5500 BC without any evidence for agriculture having been practiced or for violent confrontations. At the northern reach of the Starchevo culture, a few migrants began to arrive in Transdanubia in the area south of Lake Balaton around 5700 BC to be met by the incumbent hunter-gatherers and the Central European Balkanic agro-ecological boundary, which necessitated a period of adaptation for the cultivated plants and domesticated animals. The farmers and hunter-gatherers merged, and from this union evolved the formative and earliest linear pottery culture, first attested around 5550 BC, which within a couple of centuries fully formed, broke out north of the Alps to rapidly colonize much of the great European plain. Moving into the Ionian and Adriatic seas, in Montenegro there are 2 interesting transition sites. Crvena Stijena, meaning red rock, 30 kilometers inland, has over 23 meters of stratigraphy stretching back beyond the Middle Paleolithic. It sits at 700 meters above sea level, overlooking a canyon 600 meters below, and faces Bosnia and Herzegovina on the far side. The location is quite unsuited for agriculture. At the top of this stratigraphy, there is evidence that the Mesolithic occupants acquired Adriatic impressware and ovicaprines sometime after 6500 before abandoning the site. Odbert Cave, on the eastern side of the water divide of the Dinaric Alps, sits at the base of the upper reaches of the river Piva Canyon. The cave, at 558 meters above sea level and now under the waters of the reservoirs behind the Piva Dam, is about 140 kilometers from the Adriatic, with considerably easy access to the west and downstream into the Pannonian Plain. Occupied before 8000 BC, the hunter-gatherers acquired Starchevo pottery around 5900 BC and Adriatic impressware, some domestic fauna, which I call game in the pen, about 5700. After 5500 BC, honey flint, possibly from Bulgaria, and opal, possibly from the Rhodope Mountains, over 500 kilometers distance appear, but the lithics continued to be knapped according to the Mesolithic, Romanellian, or Paracastelnovian lithic tradition until the site was abandoned about 5000 BC. The domesticated fauna, as game in the pen, supplemented the hunt, and the occupants essentially continued their traditional lifeways during the 3,000 years of occupation until the site was abandoned. Grotta de Luzzo must rank on the island of Sicily, must rank as one of the premier transition sites. The large cave is located on the edge of a steep fan at the base of an abrupt seasonal torrent running down the hillside into the sea. Occupied before 10,000 BC, the Mesolithic occupants first acquired pre-Centinello pottery prior to 6200, with a discrete appearance of coarse pottery of unknown provenance half a millennium earlier. The domesticated fauna began to arrive in the first half of the 6th millennium, with the 4 species present by 5,800 to 5,700, representing 30 to 40% of the faunal remains by 5,500 and up to 75% by 5000 BC, with a continuing strong Mesolithic influence in the lithic tradition. The first evidence for agricultural produce appears to date from about 5,650, half a millennium after first contact with the Neolithic, and 200 to 300 years after the first acquisition of domesticated animals as game in the pen. Shortly after the evidence for agriculture, the cave site was largely abandoned, becoming an animal pen. The occupants, having accepted agriculture and completed the transition after 500 years, possibly or probably moved to the coastal plain a few kilometers south where agriculture could be practiced. The Trentino Alto Adige is the home of the Gaban late Mesolithic culture. Ensconced in their secluded, deep and wide glacial valley with wide expanses of wetland, rich in fauna and flora, the Gaban hunter-gatherers ignored the early Neolithic of the Po Plain on their doorstep for about 500 years, until about 5000 BC, when they began to acquire Fiorano pottery and later ovocaprines, which again I treat as game in the pen. Abstraction made of the site of Vilandro Plunaca, north of Bolzano, agriculture only arrived in the Middle Neolithic square-mouthed pottery culture, when they vacated their sites, many of which were in rock shelters above the valley floor at the top of rock-face screes or detrical cones. This map of the region shows selected dates for the first appearance of Neolithic attributes. Other than highlighting the time span between their first appearance in the southeast of the study area and the disappearance of the Mesolithic in the northwest, I wanted to point out how Mesolithic navigators transported ovocaprines to the Velaspila cave site, hundreds of meters up a hillside on the island of Lozinj. It's circled in blue there. Hundreds of meters up a hillside on the island of Lozinj in the Kavna Bay, centuries before Neolithic farmers arrived in the area. My conclusions are that the Mesolithic population were clearly attracted by the Neolithic. Hunter-gatherers first acquired desirable objects, such as pottery, then domesticated animals, which I call game in the pen, and finally, if at all, agriculture. The acquisition of care of game in the pen was clearly easier for hunter-gatherers to assimilate into their culture than agriculture. Mesolithic and Neolithic site locations tended to be in different geographical biotopes. Each instance is unique. No simplistic explanation or theories can reply to all the questions. So I've invented a new acronym, Albert and Albert, which means a little bit of this and a little bit of that. The transition in the study area lasted 2,500 years between 7,000 and 4,500 BC. Transitions could last over half a millennium, 30 to 40 generations. There were long-range contacts between hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists, as well as partner exchange. There is little evidence for aggressive contacts. And finally, the Mesolithic populations eventually merged with the Neolithic immigrant migrants, or immigrant farmers, and this is confirmed by genetics. Thank you.